Okay, so it's a pleasure to be here with you all. You might again be wondering what on earth a psychologist is doing here with a bunch of engineers who have an interest in music. But to put things in slightly more concrete terms, I'm a psychologist who focuses on the acquisition of language, especially in infants, which means that I spend a lot of my time trying to think about how the brain processes sound and what the sounds a human brain is trying to process are made of, which in a lot of ways overlaps with this area of musical understanding as well. So, we're going to start off with a little bit of basic brain biology, and then we'll work our way up to how speech is produced and what the characteristic features of speech are, and then we'll start looking at some relationships between audition for speech and audition for music. So there are two main perspectives that we can bring when we think about how the brain is organized. And on the left here, we have a view of the brain that looks for information processing hubs, discrete areas of the brain that might be doing a particular job. On the right-hand side, we can imagine the brain as an information transfer network, where we look at the patterns of connectivity between these different processing regions. So in a little bit more detail, when a person goes into an MRI scanner, we can take very detailed anatomical images of where the different areas of their brain are, and these have been color-coded on the outer surface, the cortex of the brain. And we can also sort of slice through the virtual brain and get different views or different perspectives of what we're looking at. We can also use a different kind of scan to look at how water flows through the brain in different directions. And this can tell us a lot about how different parts of the brain are connected to each other. So in the technique called DTI, diffusion tensor imaging, we can look at the direction and structure of the fiber tracts that connect the different parts of the brain. Now, I'm sure your high school science will have prepared you for this slide. The information processing unit of the brain is the neuron. So in a neuron, we have a cell body that is surrounded by dendrites, and those dendrites are the receptors of the neuron, and they're simply waiting for enough information to come in from other neurons to trigger an action potential that will run all the way down the length of the axon. When that action potential gets to the very end of the axon at the terminal buttons, it may be handed over to another neuron's dendrites. The secondary process that we should be aware of is this idea that around the length of the axon is what's known as the myelin sheath. And this is a fatty coating on the outside of the axon that allows that action potential to travel much faster. So the more myelin there is around the axon, the faster a signal can transfer from one part of the brain to another. Now, this cute little cartoon diagram of an axon gives us an idea of the structure, but not really the scale. This is the cell body of an axon and its true to-scale dendritic arbor. So those little incoming branches where it can detect the activation from other cells. What you can see at the bottom is the beginning of the axon. And at this scale, that axon would probably be somewhere between 30 meters in length to several kilometers in length. So the axons really do travel a very long way within the brain. So where do all of these cells exist? There's a thick layer on the outside of the brain called the cortex. And we can see here, this is actually a slice of a genuine brain of a macaque monkey, which has several structural features that are similar to our own brains. And you can see that this slice of brain has been dyed so that the cell bodies come up in this purple color. And what we can see is that thick purple layer around the outside, which is where all the cell bodies are hanging out, in that thick layer that we call the cortex. What you can see deeper inside the brain are these superhighways that connect different regions of the cortex to one another. And when we look at the cortex in different regions of the brain, what we can see is that the little neurons are stacked up differently. So different parts of the brain have different structural organization that assists with the different jobs that they do. So we have these structured layers. Now, the next slide has some actual anatomical information on it. So if you're feeling a little squeamish, you might like to sort of look at it between your fingers. But on the left here, what we have learned from the history of brain science is if we take a microscope and we look at the structures of these different neurons in different parts of the brain, we can identify that those structures seem to support different functions. These are the processing hubs that we talked about before. So in blue at the top on the left, you can see the motor cortex and its structured layers in blue below. And then at the very back part of the brain, this brain is facing to the left, at the very back part of the brain, you can see the structured layers of the visual cortex. And that's that processing hub model. But when we look at these fiber tracts, and what you can see on the top right is a photograph of the arcuate fasciculus that has been opened up, and we can see these channels that are that fatty myelin coating that are entirely to help with the speed of information transfer from one part of the brain to the other. And we can see down below one of these DTI scans, a diffusion tensor imaging scan, that shows us how anatomically that fiber tract is distributed in the brain. So, if that's how brains code information and pass information between different regions, let's look at the auditory bits that I know you guys are very interested in. So on the left here, we can see with the little pink star on it, the primary auditory cortex. This is the part of the brain where the incoming nerve signals from the cochlea come into the brain and trigger a cascade of information that flows to other brain regions. In yellow and blue are two parts of the brain that are fairly well known to be involved in language processing. So these are in blue, Broca's area, and in yellow, Wernicke's area. Now, traditional models of language processing told us that in the left hemisphere of the brain, we had two language processing areas, one at the front that was involved in the motor production of speech, and one further back that was more involved in understanding speech when it's spoken to us. And between them, there is one fiber tract, the arcuate fasciculus, that we've just seen the inside of. However, contemporary neuroscience has told us it's much more complicated than that. We actually have a ton of brain regions that are all involved in processing the sound of human language. And the connectivity patterns that you can see on the top right here are much more dense and much more diverse. And the point that I want to get to with the talk that I'm giving today is that the power that comes with having diverse connectivity patterns is what sustains our creativity. We can connect things in totally new ways that have never been connected before. And that seems to be the source of our creative impulse. So, one thing that often comes up when we think about speech and we think about music is this idea that the two hemispheres might be doing different things. So I'm just going to touch base very briefly with an idea that some of you might have come across before. The idea that the left hemisphere is involved in language and therefore rationality and also logic and mathematics and reasoning and these kind of harder edged ideas. Whereas the right hemisphere is sometimes thought to be more associated with music and creativity and openness and things like this. However, this does not turn out to be true. There are some things that the hemispheres differ on though. And the first one is a very boring biological reality. The left hemisphere of the brain handles the right hemifield of space. It handles all of the motor control for the right hand, the right arm, the right leg, all of the sensations coming in from that side of the body. It handles the visual information coming in from the right side of visual space, from both eyes. The right half of the visual information ends up in the left hemisphere. And the right part of auditory space as well. The contralateral organization goes the other way as well for the other hemisphere. So the left hemisphere controls the left side of space in the body, in the visual world, and in the auditory world. So we have a little illustration of a person down the bottom here. And one of the handy pieces of information we can take away is if we create motion in our own world, all of our senses are detecting it and sending it to the same place. So I can see my hand, I can feel my hand in space, and I might be able to hear it as well. And that's all processed in the same hemisphere of the brain. Right. And on the right-hand side, we have the obverse. But it's not 100%. And this is really interesting because when we look at the nerve signals that come from the two ears, when we think about stereo hearing, 90% of the nerve signals from this ear end up in this hemisphere, but 10% go directly to this hemisphere, right? And 90% of the nerve signals from this ear end up in this hemisphere, but 10% go directly to this hemisphere. So there are two ways of coding information. One is separating out these discrete areas in acoustic space, but the other is combining those signals as well, right? And this gives us different kinds of power to understand our position in the world when we move our head and we hear the acoustic outcome of those motions. So if it's a myth that the left and the right hemisphere have different jobs to do, why has it been so persistent? Well, it does turn out that a lot of animals try to specialize the expensive brain tissue for difficult tasks. And one way that we see this is when we look at handedness. Now, among humans, 90% of us tend to be right-handed. The ratios differ a little for left-handers depending on whether you're male or female, but it tends to be, on average, about 10% of every human population on the planet. Less than 1% of people are truly ambidextrous. And one of the things that's going on here is that the brain, remembering that one half of the brain controls one half of the body, is becoming specialized to do high precision activity in one side of the body, over and above the other. Humans are not unique in this. So when we look for animals and whether they have a dominant paw, if you've ever considered this with your own domestic pets, the jury is still out for most animals. However, any animal that does not use its paws for locomotion has an opportunity to develop their skill set in their non-locomotion paws. So the example that we have is from the marsupial clade. We have red kangaroos, eastern grey kangaroos, and red-necked wallabies, all of whom tend to be left-handed. By comparison, their cousin, the tree kangaroo, who uses its front paws to climb around in trees, does not have this handedness bias. So this is suggesting to us that if we use up all the sensory input that's coming to our paws by walking around on them, we cannot use the sensory input for fine precision motor control. So the outcome of this is that when we look at what the hemispheres really do, one of our hemispheres specializes in high temporal precision. The other does the job of all the slower stuff. So in the acoustic world, we can think of fast modulation, we can think of temporal analysis of very quick transitions between one kind of sound and another kind of sound. If we take that even further and we think about language, this takes us into the domain of the boundaries between different speech sounds or the sequences that we hear them in. And understanding spoken language requires a lot of temporal precision. So this is why the left hemisphere may have a little bit of an advantage in some elements of language processing. On the other side of the equation, we know that the right hemisphere is handling things that are less temporally precise. It might be helping us more with our understanding of pitch, melody, and in language, prosody. So that's the melodic intonation, the ups and downs of the way a speaker says their words together. So we can already start to see that there might be relationships between the kind of processing that we need to do to understand spoken language and the kind of processing that we need to do to understand certain aspects of music. There's a secondary outcome of this speed difference, which is that when we get very, very good at doing a thing, we become faster at doing it, which means that as we myelinate some of those axon pathways to become more and more efficient for doing something at high speed, what we're doing is we're parking learned information in the left hemisphere because that's where we can access it faster. Whereas when we are learning and when we do not yet have the economy of speed, we do more of that processing in the right hemisphere. So the right hemisphere does, to some extent, have an association with things that we are currently learning, things that we have never heard before, or things that we find hard to classify and categorize. Whereas the right hemisphere tends to know more stuff about the ways that we have processed things in the past, or things that we're very good at doing already. So we do seem to have something in the left that might be linked a little bit to language processing, but also probably to processing very familiar songs that we've sung many times in our lives. Any overlearned sequence will end up represented on the left. But this is not an all or nothing equation. This beautiful visualization shows us that when people are in an MRI scanner and they're simply listening to language, we can see that both hemispheres are neurally responding to the speech signal. Now, I have a question to ask of our audience, and it has to do with whether you're feeling brave. I have a very short video of an actual real live human brain. And if you're feeling squeamish, or you haven't had your breakfast yet, let's have a show of hands for who would like to see what an actual fresh brain looks like so that we can understand a little bit about its structure and the hemispheres. So show of hands, who'd like to see a brain? Okay, the rest of you may be closing your eyes. It's only 45 seconds long. So I even have a little screen, just in case. So here we go.
Unfortunately, this cancer... Unfortunately, this cancer patient died of complications secondary to a cell transplant. Here you can see how soft and pliable the dura is, and we can look down between the hemispheres and see the corpus callosum. I can also see a bit of the anterior cerebral artery coming over the surface. So this is the interhemispheric fissure. And if I turn the brain around and we look at the occipital lobe, We can see the top of the cerebellum.
Okay, so very quick, but a few features there that are interesting. The two hemispheres are very separate except at that lower part where there is a dense bundle of fiber connections between the two hemispheres, the corpus callosum that we saw there. And we sometimes forget about how much information is passing backwards and forwards between these two hemispheres, but it does seem to be a very important part of our auditory processing abilities. The other thing that I want to mention about the processing of complex auditory information is that the processing beyond just those few regions we looked at before, one that might have to do with understanding what we've heard, another that might have to do with how we might be preparing to generate speech ourselves, is that the system for engaging with linguistic content is very, very complicated, and every year we're adding new modules to our understanding of how this works. So this is still work in progress. But what we can see here is that there are processing chains that have to do with understanding content and other processing chains that have to do with thinking about what you might need to do to produce that content yourself. So what we can see up here is a lot of pathways that are leading up to that sort of headband section across the top, which we saw earlier as the motor cortex. So perception of speech always seems to have in it some kind of representation of the body that produced it, or how our own bodies might produce it. Which leads me to the next little section in the talk, which is how human bodies generate speech. So, we're looking at quite a lot of MRI data today, and this is one of the funnest examples of MRI that I know of. What we're going to see is a slice through a person's head while they're in a scanner singing along to Adele. So what you get to see is how all the inside parts of their mouth are moving as they generate these noises.
It's no secret that the both of us are.
We'll just wait for the lights.
Wait a minute.
Yeah.
This screen will be much better.
Okay.
It's no secret that the both of us are running out of time.
Going on inside, right? And what's interesting about this example is that all of us are doing this all the time with absolutely no awareness of exactly how massive our tongue is, like what that flappy bit at the back is that sort of goes up and down randomly, and like how dynamic our vocal production organs are when we produce speech. So we're going to break down some of these steps so that we can understand in a little bit more detail. So we have a person here on the left. We have two bags of air, the lungs. The first thing that happens is we squeeze the lungs to push the air out, and then we have a tissue membrane in the throat, the glottis, that pulls two folds together in the way of the air. Now this is going to vibrate in a sinusoid. So I'm glad we've been talking about sinusoids and Fourier transforms, because this is going to keep coming back. So the two tissue membranes will will be pushed apart by the air that forms a bubble as it exits, and then the two membranes close again behind. So we have a little video of that. It might look like something else at first, but it's not. So again, there's air just pushing its way out between these two vocal folds, causing that sinusoidal vibration. Lovely. Now, what's nice about this is we have a very basic process going on that you guys should be all over, right? We have a source plus filter situation. We have the glottal source, which is just that vibrating tissue membrane, and then on top we have a resonator. This is just an air cavity that as the sound waves vibrate through, the shape of the cavity will cause the resulting sound to have a different acoustic structure. So we can imagine something similar when we think about two instruments that might produce the same pitch, but their timbre may be very different, right? So even though it's the same fundamental frequency, the harmonics of the resonating cavity are different. Good, I've got some nods, yes. All right, so here is an example of what happens when you take a 3D print of a human resonator and just whack it on top of a vocal production source. Responsible for this beautiful demonstration have actually told us that everyone else in the lab can tell whose voice it is, right? Because the 3D print is so precise that it is actually mimicking the way that that sound waves propagate through their vocal folds and through their vocal tract, and to such a degree of precision that you can actually tell who it is. So I have one more example where we're going to get into details of a particular kind of speech sound that I work on in some of my own research, but it gives us a really nice illustration of how the sensory system itself, the body, and learning work in tandem. So we're going to figure out what's going on with vowels.
A, E, I, O.
So what's nice about vowels is that they're very simple from a mechanical perspective. If the vocal folds are vibrating and the mouth is open, it's a vowel. The only thing that differs is the shape of the resonator above that vocal source. So here are three vowels that we're going to pay attention to.
I, A.
And if we look at where the tongue is when it reaches the kind of most exaggerated point, we can see that the tongue position is different in all of these. Now, there is something that probably many of you will have noticed, which is that the ooh also has something going on with the lips, right, compared to the other two. The ooh has this like rounded lip shape. But we're going to focus on the tongue for now, because if we map those three tongue positions onto just one mouth, we can see that two of them are high, one of them is low, one of them is at the front, one of them is at the back, and one of them is in the middle. So we get a triangle. We'll call this the vowel triangle. because we're very creative. But just as a reminder, all that is happening here is that the sounds that we hear are simply a very predictable outcome of the shape of the resonating chamber above the source. So these visualizations have been produced from the auditory waveform itself. And they're 3D models of what shape the air gap would have to be if a sound were to come out sounding the way it did, right? All based entirely on Fourier transforms. So if we take an E, an R, and an U, and we run a spectrographic analysis on them, at the top we can see the loudness profile, just the basic waveform, and underneath we can see a frequency spectrogram. And this is telling us when it is darker, how much acoustic energy there is at different frequency bands. And if we run a Fourier transform on this raw acoustic data, we end up with some prominent bands of acoustic energy that are behaving as sinusoids, the harmonics of the resonating chamber. So E, R, and U in human speech perception are detected by human listeners according to the harmonics of the vocal tract. Right. Let's look at how messy human speech is, though. Because if we map out first and second formants, and by first and second I mean the one at the bottom is the first harmonic of the resonating chamber. The second one up is the second harmonic. This is not fundamental frequency, I should say. This is not the pitch of the voice. This is just the shape of the resonator. Right. So if we look at human speech production, these are a bunch of Americans in 1954 saying a bunch of different English words. And what we can see here up the top in blue is the distribution across formant space for things that had an E sound. In bright red, we have the formant space for things that had an A sound, like in cat. Down here in this purpley blue color, we can see the distribution in formant space of things that had an oo sound. Right, so once again, we can see that triangle. Right, we can see the E, the R, and the oo are far apart from each other in 2 dimensions. So let's put our mouth back on. And sadly, it's the wrong way round. So we'll just have to sort of rotate it a bit and then flip it over. And now we can see that the E up the top here is what we got when the tongue was very high and front in the mouth. And the R was what we got when the tongue was very low in the mouth. And the oo at the back we got when the tongue was very high towards the back of the mouth. So there is a direct relationship between the physiology of the producer of speech and the acoustics that we can measure from the spoken acoustic artifact. So, where do the brains come in again? Well, it's kind of interesting because human babies are born with very tiny heads. They have to get out somehow. And their heads have to grow a lot before they reach their adult size. And what's happening over that maturational period is not only more neurons being born, but also radical changes in the connectivity profile of each neuron. So what we can see here is some visualizations of neural connectivity in the cortex of a newborn on the left, a 1-month-old, 3-month-old, 6-month-old, 15-month-old, and a 2-year-old on the right. And in just those 2 years of time, we can see that the newborn did not have much connection going on between the neurons that were in their cortex. But by 2 years of age, they have this very, very different connectivity profile. Now, over those first 2 years, a child is bathed in sound. Before they're born, they have a very limited range of sounds that they can hear because most of the things that they can hear are somewhat muffled by being on the inside of a sort of wet balloon, right? So by the time they get out, all of a sudden the world of sound is available to them and they can begin neurologically encoding how it is patterned. Brains are very basic. They only really have a couple of learning mechanisms. The first is Hebbian learning, which is known by the shorthand neurons that fire together, wire together, which means if you very often encounter one sensory stimulus in the context of another sensory stimulus, then over time, those two neurons will link up physically such that when you encounter one of those sensory stimuli, you will fire the neuron that normally fires in the presence of the other. This is how the Pavlov dog trick works. You ring the bell, feed the dog, ring the bell, feed the dog, ring the bell, feed the dog, and eventually you ring the bell and the dog starts salivating even when there's no food. Because the neurons that fired together have wired together. The second process we've also already talked about, this is this myelination, the idea that brains will build up these fatty coatings along the axons that allow them to transmit information faster. And what I like to remind us of is the idea that myelination is an active process. A lot of textbooks will simply sort of say it's a fatty coating, but not really explain how it got there or what it is, but it's actually another living cell type. So over here we have a very happy neuron with a giant dendritic arbor where it can receive connections from other neurons. Its axon is the long curvy bit down here. But we can see these guys over here, the oligodendrocytes, which is a different kind of cell whose arms actually wind around the axons of the neurons that fire the most. And if a neuron doesn't get used for a while, then those oligodendrocytes are just going to gradually unwind, let go, and send their arms in a different direction. So this is the real use it or lose it stuff, right? But what this means is the paths traveled most become fast. So we've talked about vowels. We've talked about how we generate them. We've talked about their acoustic signals. Next, we're going to talk about how does a baby hear them. So, what we have here is a visual representation of the acoustic space, informant space, between E, R, and U, and we have a bonus sound as well. This is the sound U, which is in Mandarin Chinese. It has the rounding of the lips that the U sound has, but it has the tongue position of the E sound. So this gives us an extra dimension in acoustic space. Now there's a series of interesting studies where if we play babies who have been growing up in an English-speaking environment, the sound ooh, and they might hear a sequence that goes ooh, 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 ooh. So that ooh sound. Or they might hear ooh, 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 ooh. They cannot hear the first one, that change from ooh, 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 but they can hear the change from ooh, 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 ooh. And it's kind of curious, it's a perceptual asymmetry, but it tells us that there's something about ooh that is just more salient to a newborn's hearing. They hear it with more fidelity. When they hear ooh, 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 somehow their brain is treating it like just a rubbish ooh, right? But when they hear the ooh, 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 they're like, whoa, my world just got better, amazing. Now, for a while it was thought that maybe this was because English babies don't hear ooh. They don't hear that ooh sound, right? But they do hear ooh. So maybe this has to do with experience. But German babies do it too, and German babies definitely hear the sound. right? So there's something going on here that all babies all over the world are better at hearing oo compared to u. So the researchers involved in this program of work went back and checked a bunch of other sounds. And they tried to look at versus which English has but German doesn't. And once again, they found that there was a symmetrical pattern for babies all over the world. There are some sounds that babies preferentially respond to and others that they don't. And having continued this work for almost a decade, it turns out that the further towards the very, very corners of vowel space, the more likely a baby is going to be able to hear it. So this is that vowel triangle again, that E, R, U. These are the corners of the mouth. This is the most different we can make our own speech sound from itself. So the peripheries of human acoustic space are privileged in hearing for a newborn. This little graphic shows us the variety of speech sounds that humans are capable of making. If you've had any linguistic training, you might recognize some of these symbols as coming from the International Phonetic Alphabet. Each little symbol there represents a different kind of speech sound that some languages, but perhaps not all, have in their acoustic repertoire. The colour bar that you can see at the side tells us out of 1,600 odd languages, what percentage of languages have that sound. And we can see that most of these sounds occur in less than 5% of the world's languages, right? Humans can do some amazing things with their vocal tracts, but some of them are so unusual that only a few languages have bothered. There are other sounds that everybody uses. And if we look down at the bottom where we have the representation of vowels, one of the things that we see is E, R, and oo coming back again as the top winners in vowel space. So human babies have a higher degree of sensory fidelity for hearing the sounds that are at the peripheries of articulation space, and human languages choose those sounds more often than other sounds that they're capable of producing. So perception and production are linked. But given this beautiful diversity, it also means that change is possible. We're not born with one kind of hearing and then stuck with it. So one way I like to think about this is if we have some kind of a sensory space that has what we might think of as attractor states. There are some regions of acoustic space that are more likely to attract an activation. So then, if we take this sensory space and we imagine that it's flexible, it's a rubber sheet with a few depressions on. If we drop some coins on this rubber sheet, the first time that we drop them, those coins might roll into one of these attractor states, and that's what we perceive. But if we continue dropping coins for a very long time, what's going to happen is that rubber sheet is going to distort and sharpen those representations so that they are more efficient, more myelinated, and cause us to treat sounds as though they are more similar to one another. Because anything within that bucket falls in, and we can't anymore get out the acoustic differences between them. Now, this process of perceptual adaptation is well known throughout the animal world. What's interesting though in the case of human language is that if we change the nature of the stimulation over time, and perhaps instead of dropping the E, R, oo sounds in exactly the same places, some humans might experience a different sensory environment where they only hear sounds often in one of those attractor states, and that attractor state may expand into the territory that was previously covered by different attractor states, right? So when babies are first born, they have these privileged sensory sweet spots, but then with exposure to human languages, they can adapt their acoustic space. And if they've adapted their acoustic space like this, and then later on they get stimulation of a different kind, they might have to revise their perceptual space to account for different inputs. So, all of this takes time. And if we think back to the way that the brain is doing this job, what we can see is that those first 2 years are glorious. Those first 2 years allow the possibility of forming new connections that help us to better represent the speech sounds that we have in our particular environment. And what's intriguing is that human infants also spend the same time learning how to make those sounds with their own bodies. It takes babies about 6 months to figure out how to breathe on demand rather than breathe just to keep themselves alive. It takes them a couple more months before they can figure out how to squeeze their vocal folds reliably in the airstream to produce that ah sound. And once they've got that far, they might be able to sort of start manipulating the shape of the resonating chamber a little bit, and that's when babies get to the stage, right? Cooing. After that, they might figure out how to cut up the speech stream with consonants, where they might be at the stage where they go and all they're doing is listening to the outcome, producing some speech, listening to the outcome, producing some speech, and trying to refine their representations of the audio and the motor gestures together. So, is it possible then to learn more than one system at once? If we have all of this possibility space and one language, say English, occupies this possibility space for speech sounds, and another language, say Mandarin, occupies this space, there are differences between those two systems. I'll overlap them so you can see a bit more clearly. The blue one is English, the pink one is Mandarin. Some of the sounds are overlapping, but others are not. How does a human brain handle more than one form of perceptual adaptation? Now, fortunately, we have Panlei with us today because I'm about to share some of her data. Lei has been doing a series of studies where we try and figure out how hearing develops in children and how hearing may differ for adults when they are hearing sounds like per and bur, right? So we have here a picture of a peach, a picture of a beach. Because this is a study for children, we also have a cute monkey who likes to go to the beach, also likes to eat a peach, and when you hear a sound, you have to decide which side of the screen he should go to, right? Down the bottom, we have per and bur sounds that are very, very finely calibrated to help us understand how a listener hears the per and bur sound in English. So we have one like this, beach, that is very bur-y, and one at the other end of the spectrum, peach, very per-y. In between, we have a lot of very finely grained beach tokens that differ by beach, just a tiny bit, 10 milliseconds in the timing of two acoustic events. And when we give people a task like this and ask them about 160 times whether the monkey should go to the beach or eat a peach, what we can do is we can map out a psychometric function that tells us, that models for us what their perception looks like. Now, to cut to the chase, when we do this in two different languages, when we do this in English and we do it in Mandarin, each person shows us that their response profile for English and their response profile for Mandarin are different from one another. So the point at which they swap over from saying, oh, that was definitely beach, definitely bur, or in the case of Mandarin, E, and definitely P. I'm doing my best, I don't speak Mandarin. The point at which they swap over is different in terms of the fine-grained acoustics of those sounds. So we can see that the red line is further to the right than the blue line, and this is highly, highly reliable across a large group of participants. So, where does that take us? We start with innate sensory sweet spots. There are things in our auditory world that just are better, they're more salient, they're things we can hear more clearly. And then on top of that, we have this adaptive process of experience-dependent tuning that is a high-speed, high-precision activity that seems to be related not just to how we hear things, but also how we might move our own bodies to produce those things. This happens as the brain matures and grows, and it happens as the neuron connectivity patterns change. So where does music fit in? This MRI scan gives us a visualization of which parts of the cortex are involved when someone is listening to a story, listening to music, or is active equally for both of those tasks. So the orange color here is the area of overlap. Now we can see that the story is engaging different parts of the brain compared to music and overlap. But the overlap area is huge. There's a lot of shared neurological representation. Another way that we can look at the similarities between speech processing and music processing are when we look at what's called the frequency following response, which is a neurological signal for how certain communities of neurons fire shortly after an auditory stimulation has occurred. And the vast majority of frequency following response characteristics are shared between music and language. Do we see experience-dependent learning in music? So I've got another MRI for a kind of musical experience that might require quite a lot of learning.
Here we go.
Okay, he goes on a bit, but you get the idea. This is a highly skilled performance. It's musical, it's not linguistic. However, we can already see that the instrument that this person is performing on is the same one that you and I just saw in the singing example before and in the speech example at the beginning, where the manipulation of an acoustic resonator that happens to be inside this person's head is controlled with speed and precision. So as we get to the very wrap up of this presentation, I just want to share the idea that when we put musicians who are skilled and trained in different disciplines in a scanner, what we see is left hemisphere dominant activation for the instrument that they are skilled in performing. So the beatboxers up the top here show left hemisphere activation selectively for when they are listening to beatboxing, but do not show that for when they are listening to a guitarist. The guitarists show selective left hemisphere activation for their highly learned instrument, the guitar, but they do not show it for beatboxing. right? So we're seeing another form of experience-dependent neural activity parked more on the left than on the right when the high-speed temporal precision is involved. This leaves us with one final question. Is there something like a sensory sweet spot? Something that is innate, something that is shared, something that provides the foundation prior to this learning experience? So we'll just watch this one final video to get us in the mood for some more music, and also thinking about which elements within music we might be universal, human, and shared.
Talking about expectations. Watch. What's interesting to me about that is, regardless of where I am, anywhere, every audience gets that. But it doesn't matter, you know, that's just, you know, the pentatonic scale for some reason.
If you're looking for a job in neuroscience,
So on that note, with this idea of sensory sweet spots, I want to wish you all a very sweet weekend, and I look forward to hearing what delights you have prepared for us in your concert.